Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to BWI Marshall's virtual town hall. My name is Kiva Rodriguez, and I am the Deputy Chief Engineer of the Maryland Aviation Administration's Division of Planning and Engineering. This virtual event is the third event in a three-part series specifically designed to update our community of airport tenants, contractors, and MBE partners. I'm going to start with some housekeeping announcements. Today's live seminar will last up to 90 minutes and it is being recorded. We will send a follow-up email by the next day or so that will include the slides presented today and the recording. If you are experiencing audio or visual issues, please disconnect from the meeting and reconnect. If you are participating through the Teams platform, your microphone is muted. This enables our speakers to present uninterrupted. If you are calling in, please mute your phones. We are taking questions through the chat feature on your screen. To do this, you will select the Q&A button on the right side of the screen. There is an option to select Ask Anonymously. Your questions will be posed to the presenters during today's program by ADCI's Alan Peljevich. Any questions we are not able to cover during today's program will be answered in a follow-up email. Since March, the MAA team has focused on implementing strategies and procedures to help ensure the health and safety of contractors, passengers, and employees. Today, you will hear from several staff members on the MAA team. You will hear how the MAA is promoting the safety measures that are in place and how we are implementing the strategies included in the MAA's Pandemic Recovery Plan. You will also hear from two representatives from the American Council of Engineering Companies, Maryland, Mr. Tony Frascarella, who serves as the president of ACEC Maryland, and Mr. Jim Otradovec, who serves as the executive director. They will discuss the consultant's perspective of the COVID-19 pandemic. And now I will introduce our first speaker. Governor Hogan appointed Ricky Smith as the executive director of the Maryland Aviation Administration in July of 2015. Ricky has more than 30 years of transportation leadership experience, including leading the Cleveland Airport system for 9 years. He is responsible for the planning, operation, and management of BWI Marshall and Martin State Airports, along with regional aviation activities for the entire state. And now, Mr. Ricky Smith.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. First of all, thank you all so much for joining us for this third of our three-part webinar series. This is all part of an effort to try to remain connected to our important stakeholders and at the same time provide you some insight as to how things are going with your airport. The first two were very successful, and we expect this one to be at least equally successful. So again, thank you so much for joining us. I also want to take this time to thank our longtime partners, ACEC Maryland, for partnering with us on this effort. You know, the engineering community is so important to everything we do here at BWI Marshall and Martin State Airport, that we thought any conversation with the contracting community would be most appropriate if our engineering partners joined us. And so thank you so very much for our partners at ACEC for joining us with this. So if I can move on to the next slide. This slide is a slide that, am I moving the slides or is someone else moving the slides? There you go. This slide is a slide that we live by today. It is it shows kind of where we started out with this pandemic and how we're progressing through the pandemic from a passenger traffic standpoint. This chart is actually tracking passengers that go through our security checkpoints on a weekly basis. You know, leading up to this pandemic, mid-March, we were actually pacing to another record-setting year. It was going to be our fifth consecutive record-setting year for passengers. And then we hit the coronavirus, COVID-19. And as you see to the far left of this chart, around mid-March to early April, the economy bottomed out. The pandemic hit its peak, at least one of its peaks, and then passenger traffic hit lows that we had never experienced since 9/11. 9/11, where we had virtually 100% traffic reduction, but it was not for an unpredictable period of time. With COVID-19, during the mid-March, early April period, we actually saw traffic reductions approaching 96, 97%, which is just amazing to have to go through that. And as you can tell, it kind of followed a somewhat of an L shape. It's a funny looking L. The bottom line shows how we're charting now. So around the 4th of July weekend, we kind of saw the peak of our recent recovery. Traffic was up to around a reduction of around 66, 67%. And as you can tell, as you move closer to the right of the chart, we've been kind of stagnant at that 65 to 67% reduction in traffic, which is not the best place to be, but it's certainly much better than where we started. As bad as that is, we're not as bad as the rest of the industry, particularly those in the region. Normally we're ranked 22nd in the country in terms of passengers. During this pandemic, today we're ranked 11th, right? And that has a lot to do with just how well we recovered compared to the rest of the industry. We are typically about 37, 38% of the Washington-Baltimore region's market share. We're the busiest in the region, but that's based primarily on a plurality of traffic. Today, we're handling about 51, 52% of that traffic. And so for the last 2 months, where traffic has been reported to the FAA, that will be the months of June and July, we've handled more traffic at BWI than Reagan National and Washington Dulles combined, which is just an amazing place to be, even in the midst of a pandemic. But again, it speaks to the fact that we are recovering at a better rate than not just other airports in the country, but certainly the 2 other airports in our region. And that has a lot to do with one, the fact that we enjoy a very strong economy. Even in the worst of cases, the Maryland-Washington economy continues to be one of the stronger economies in the country. One, because we tend to have a very high median income on average, and so there's discretionary spending here that some other parts of the country do not enjoy. There's always enormous government spending, public health, national defense, security, cybersecurity, research. All of those institutions that are in the Washington-Baltimore region continue to push monies into the economy that kind of keeps this economy moving, unlike other economies, other regions in the country. And so we benefit from that as an airport in that region. The reason we do better than other airports in the region is because, one, we happen to have a hub carrier, or the largest carrier here, that is one of the more financially strong airlines in the country. That has been the case traditionally, and that continues to be the case. Southwest Airlines continues to be in a very strong position financially relative to other airports. I don't want that statement to suggest that they are not experiencing financial challenges like other airlines, but they're still pretty strong relative to other airlines, and so we benefit from that. They're also an airline that is very popular in general for in terms of customer preference, and that's why we tend to lead the region. But they're also extremely popular to the leisure traveler, which is very price sensitive, cost sensitive. and given Southwest Airlines' low fare position, they tend to be more attractive to leisure travelers. And it shouldn't be a secret that that aspect of our country that is traveling the most is the leisure segment. We have a lot of pent up demand to get out, to go to places where you can enjoy yourself outdoors, or just to see loved ones on a leisure basis. And so those are the ones who are driving the air service market right now. And BWI has always been the airport of choice for leisure travelers in this region and one of the preferred airports in the country. And so because of those factors and many others, we happen to be an airport that people generally enjoy visiting. We see ourselves in a stronger position than most other airports. And so that's kind of where we are. However, be that as it may, we've still experienced some challenges, right? Our parking program, for example, was significantly impacted, where we found ourselves having to close two of our parking products, two of our long-term surface lots. And we're taking special effort to manage our shuttle service to reduce costs there. Our food and retail program, for example, took a hit. We were down at the peak of this pandemic. We had closed some 80% of our food and retail operations. We're now down to about 52% of them are open now, which is one of the better numbers in the country. And that has a lot to do with some aggressive efforts we took on to kind of mitigate the impact of the traffic demand loss that they were experiencing. We immediately took efforts to action to provide them rent relief so that they could provide as much service as they could and not be burdened with unreasonable rents. We started out by removing the MAG for our food and retail operators. And so they were just required to pay a percentage rent. So if you had no activity, then you paid no rent, which was good. We also allowed them to modify their operating hours, their business hours as well. And so because of that, when the traffic began to come back, they were in a much better position to begin to provide service and begin to reopen. And so we also did a lot of work to educate the public on what was going on at the airport. The key to this recovery, the key so far and the key going forward will be consumer confidence. To the extent that we can help our passenger base feel comfortable that it is safe to come to the airport itself and then safe to fly, then that will help us rebound. And so we were engaged in pretty aggressive marketing communications campaigns, safe to fly campaigns, campaigns to educate the public on all the social distancing measures that we took in the airport, the very aggressive and expansive cleaning, disinfecting, and sanitizing efforts that we engaged in throughout the airport. Those were all efforts that that was important to inform the public about, so that they could feel more comfortable coming to the airport. And so to respond to this economic impact that I just talked about, we embarked on a comprehensive plan that we refer to as our Runway to Recovery. It is our pandemic response plan, which was rather comprehensive. The plan was designed to address the passengers' experience from the time they enter the campus to the time they board an aircraft. And we actually spent some time trying to understand through research and consumer interaction, to try to understand what was important to the customer, what were their concerns, what would deter them from coming to the airport, what would entice them to feel comfortable flying, and so that we can make sure that we baked measures into this recovery plan that would address those issues. And so I talked earlier about parking. Well, we obviously took steps with our parking program. We expanded our shuttle service after limiting our shuttle service to provide more space for physical distancing on our shuttle buses. Entering the terminal, you'll find plexiglass systems throughout the facilities, both the terminals at BWI and Martin State Airport, as well as our rental car facility, all aimed at protecting our employees and our customers. Social distancing markers throughout the terminal, as well as signage reminding people how to be safe by wearing masks and face coverings to comply with the executive order to wear face coverings throughout the terminal building. And so we took a comprehensive approach to getting through this, and this is all reflected in our Runway to Recovery plan. I talked earlier about the safety awareness campaigns. We have a pretty robust, if we can go back, please. We have a pretty robust social media platform that we use. And so we tapped all of our social media platforms, one, to push information out, but to also receive feedback from our customers. Those that were using the terminal, they provided us very important feedback. And so we were able to push that information out. As you can imagine, as the governor managed and led through this pandemic from both a national and a state standpoint, he continued to push out new executive orders based on the advice that he was receiving from his public health advisors, and we had to react to that. And so it was important that we pushed information out to our public to help them understand what the airport was doing, what changes were occurring at the airport, so that they could be prepared to comply with those changes. Next slide, please. And again, this is our campaign around an effort to convince people that it was safe to return to the airport and fly. The airlines did a lot of work themselves to that end, and so we thought it was important that we help people understand that it's safe to come to the airport. There was a recent study that was released that it was actually a study conducted by IATA, the International Air Transportation Association, that concluded that it is from an air cleanliness standpoint, it is safer to be on an airplane than it is to be in your home or in a hospital. That is how safe it is to be on an aircraft. And so that kind of information is important in terms of helping the public become more comfortable with flying and supporting our air carrier activities. And so we use our Safe to Fly campaign to push that kind of information out. Next slide. I talked earlier about the financial relief efforts. Both with our airlines, we were able to defer the rents that our airlines pay us. We were able to defer that out until the beginning of the next calendar year. And I talked about the decisions to remove the MAGs and allow our other operators to go to percentage rent arrangements, and to also modify either their operating hours or the level of service that they were providing, so that they weren't just assuming unnecessary costs during these challenging times. And so we took a comprehensive and aggressive approach to getting through this whole pandemic. Many recognize BWI as a leader in many of the things that we did in the industry because of our approach. And it all had everything to do with the fact that we recognize that the airport is an ecosystem, and it does not function at all without a recognition that our partners play a critical role in providing the services to our public, and in the case of the audience here, developing airport facilities, designing and engineering airport facilities, planning airport facilities in a way that will enhance the customer's experience and make sure that we always have safe and secure facilities. So again, that concludes my remarks. I want to thank again you all for participating in this. I'm looking forward to my fellow panel members. I think they will provide some very informative material for you. and hopefully it will enlighten your experience as you prepare to continue through this pandemic in a safe and productive manner. With that being said, I will turn it back over to the moderator, and he will manage the Q&A. Or she.
Okay, Ricky, this is Alan Pelcevich. Hello, everyone. While we wait and give you an opportunity, one more opportunity to ask any questions in the Q&A session, Ricky, I did have a question. I'm curious in your discussions with the airlines, all of them, how they're treating COVID in terms of their longer range strategic plans. Do they see this as a blip on the radar, or do they see it as a sea change, or they're just so reactive right now they don't have their head above the trench?
So I think most influencers in our economy, not just in the transportation industry, see this pandemic as a temporary event. Now, what temporary means differs depending on who you talk to. The airlines, for example, I mean, if you talk to one airline, you've talked to one airline. I mean, each one of them, they have their own internal strategy to approaching this pandemic. Southwest Airlines, for example, they initially acted on what we call a V-shape response. They were anticipating a V-shaped recovery, right? A very quick drop in the economy and a very quick return. I think we're now experiencing what's more like an L-shaped economy. It was a quick drop, and we think the return is going to be extended over a period of time. Many of us are looking at least a couple years before we get back to pre-COVID levels. I think many of the carriers see it the same way. You can tell by their scheduling, but they continue to add capacity because people are flying. But different carriers have different forecasts that they're banking on. Spirit, for example, has a much more conservative rebound or return than Southwest, and other airlines also have their own unique plans. We're very fortunate to have Southwest, which is a little more bullish in terms of their return, and I think that's working out for us, and that's why we see ourselves rebounding at a quicker pace than most other airports.
Excellent. Okay, thank you. We don't seem to have any more questions for this segment, so Kiva, I will toss it back to you.
Thank you, Alan, and thank you, Ricky. We especially thank you for your steadfast leadership during this unprecedented time. If you, by chance, do submit a question that was not read by Alan during this Q&A period, we will be distributing a follow-up email with answers. Our next speaker, Paul Schenk, is the Chief Engineer of the Division of Planning and Engineering for the Maryland Aviation Administration. He has served in this capacity for over a decade. He has led the planning, design, and construction of the billion-dollar capital improvement and systems preservation program at BWI Marshall and Martin State Airports. He oversees MAA's Office of Engineering and Construction, Office of Architecture, Office of Planning, and Office of Environmental Services. He will be discussing the impacts due to the pandemic, as well as recovery efforts and progress made through this challenging time. We welcome Paul Schenk to our discussion, and now we will hear from Paul.
Thank you, Kiva. Good afternoon, folks. Hopefully everyone can hear me fine, and thank you for queuing up the first slide. So our focus today is obviously what is the impact to our projects as a result of COVID-19. And what I would note is that if you recall back in March, Governor Hogan issued a state of emergency stating that no Maryland resident should leave their home unless it was essential for the job or an essential reason, such as obviously obtaining food, medicine, or medical attention. So with respect to us, it meant only essential business could remain open with scaled down staff and telework. In our case, construction work and associated engineering and management work were designated as essential and not subject to stay-at-home regulations. All of the BWI construction contractors were permitted to proceed with construction. The Office of Safety and Risk Management issued COVID-19 safety requirements relating to face coverings, social distancing, vehicle occupancies, facility access, and then questionnaires to be used by the contractors to follow and report compliance with our state requirements. What's interesting is at this time, I noted that contractors could proceed with construction. We did have some contractors on some contracts who requested to stop work because of the close proximity of the work with the labor force. And so we were able to grant them time extensions to comply with the on-site unique social distancing requirements with their specific work. Next slide, please. So what's the impact to the MAA as a result of COVID-19? So as Ricky said, we went into what we referred to as a pause. And so we had 59 projects valued at almost $600 million in the study phase. We had to put those projects on hold. We had nearly 50 projects in design at over $400 million in value. They too were put on hold. Now, within that, there were some, as time progressed between March and today, where we were allowed to continue our projects, and I'll touch upon those. Then when you looked at what was in procurement, today we have DY lighting project that will be on the street, is on the street. And then also we're queuing up an airline maintenance facility project as they have been allowed to continue. Next slide, please. It must have been my face. There we go. This is merely a visual of the kind of parking impacts that are exemplify the COVID-19 impact. So you saw previous slide was a full parking lot that represented our normal operation. And then you saw as a result of COVID-19, how essentially the lot on a normal business day was essentially empty. Now you look into the terminal itself and you see the Concourse B checkpoint looks essentially empty during what would normally be a normal business hours. That place would be filled with passengers. The same with the DE checkpoint. So clearly the pandemic had a major impact on our operation, and these are ways to just help visualize it for those of you who have not been visiting our airport during this period. Next slide, please. So with respect to July, the majority, as Ricky touched upon, of the Capital Region passengers, the Baltimore-Washington Capital Region passengers, were flying out of BWI, which is good news. And in the fourth quarter of 2020, Southwest is planning on offering 2/3 of their seat capacity on their aircraft. Next slide, please. So we're touching now upon our progress as we proceed through the pandemic period, and let's lead off with our next slide. And so let's first talk about our Concourse A extension. So in Terminal AB, this was identified as an enabling project to allow us to move forward with a multi-$100-million Terminal AB project. And so this project adds on 5 additional gates to the existing Concourse A. And I think what's important is the timeliness of the design here. COVID impacts us in many ways, but this particular project literally was planned 15 years ago. It was part of the original design. And for cost savings, we deferred this work until capacity needs or maintenance of operation needs came to the forefront. And that's how come this project was moving forward as an enabling project for the upcoming AB project. And so just some of the highlights are shown in the slide. The size of the facility, you see about 55,000 square feet of expansion. What's key for our airport is all of our capital projects, you're going to see improvements being made not only to the hold rooms, but also the concessions. And in some of the unique features of the site for those engineers and architects on the call with us today, you'll see a very unique, innovative cantilever design. So we get the building envelope space that we need without negatively impacting the apron level operating area. So it's a win-win for both parties. Then for cost efficiencies, a simple truss system enabled this open floor plan. And so in addition to gates and in addition to concessions, a key improvement for our airport is restrooms. I'll be talking more in detail about that later. And then of course, loading bridges and then all of the associated electrical, mechanical, and very important for an airport, operating air carrier airport storage facilities. Next slide, please. So what you see is the Concourse A, originally we had it finishing in March, completion date June 18. And because of the COVID-19, we started experiencing delays. We had some weather delays, that's built into the program. But what we saw is that COVID-19 was going to have an impact, as I said, because it wasn't just prime contractors that you had to accommodate, you also had to accommodate all the subcontractors. And so what we saw is that on a typical work day, you might have up to 125 people working in the contract construction area in an area of roughly, with 2 floors, 55,000 square feet. Next slide, please. So what were the challenges? Well, during the course of this project, we had, as everyone is aware, continuously changing state and federal guidance. So we had to incorporate those changes into an active construction project. So simultaneous construction of concessions also was a consideration. So we not only were building the building, but we had set up for ourselves through our partnering agreement with the team that we would try to deliver the project complete, including subcontracting work for the tenants, for the concessions. And that's a big challenge for a capital program. And obviously the varying levels of COVID-19 response, there were some challenges there. We did have some cases that were reported by the subtenant contractors, and we had to deal with those, and we dealt with them capably, primarily in terms of some of the adjustments that you're going to see. So one of the things that we did is we made sure that we kept people informed. It's all about communication. As I said, we saw that we were getting a higher number of call outs, not only of individual firms and subcontractors on the program at the airport, but also individuals, particularly those individuals that might be at risk due to age or health conditions. So there was some pullback. But we had to maintain our production to allow for social distancing. And one of the ways that we dealt with that, because of the multiple contractors, because of the social distancing requirements, is that we worked with the contract team and split the project up. And we knew that this was going to have an impact to the schedule, and we were projecting a 2-month delay. So what are some of those mitigations? It said, well, Hensel Phelps, who in this particular case was the prime contractor, developed a corporate level COVID-19 response plan, which was shared proactively with the entire team, the primes, the subs, the inspection team, the design team, the tenants, the subtenants for the site. In addition, it had to be, as I said, because of the continual changes that occur, it had to be a living document. So it changed as the project progressed. Next slide, please. This one is kind of, for me, is the meat of the specific solutions that were employed on the job site. So first of all is that we added into the construction site hand sanitizer stations and additional porta facilities. We put in separate hand washing sinks for contractor personnel, segregated. We put in high traffic area sanitizing And then we also did a second shift. We first did a trial, and then we did a full implementation of a second shift so that we reduced the workforce that I said was roughly every day 125 people to half that. Now that had a cost associated with it, but we were able to accommodate it in the overall project budget in the interest of safety. We also, as I mentioned, we had the on-site health screening questionnaire. It makes no sense to show up at the job sick, so we encourage people to follow their own self-assessments. Plus, we did the questionnaire on site. We had, of course, the face coverings while we're doing the site. And then this one is kind of hidden, where we said weekly we would do what we call full site cleaning. We'd literally go in and clean the site. Now, realize that the building in many of the periods of time was open to the outside air, but we treated it as an enclosed structure, but we relied on the belts and suspenders of the open air environment that we were working in. Thank you for flashing up the COVID-19 questionnaire that was used with the firms. The other thing that was done is that we used it as a mobile app so that we didn't have a lot of paperwork. Electronic health screening, daily reminders through the mobile, and then notifications. And the most important thing is that we religiously followed the latest in the CDC guidance. Next slide, please. Yes, these are just some of the examples of notifications. Thank you. Next slide. There we go. So what it shows then is that, our original project completion end was July 31st, but through teamwork, communications, and scheduling, impact analysis, we were able to limit that to 4 weeks. What you see are some of the photographs of the finished project. You'll see a major concession there with R&R Seafood. And then you see the gates. Next slide, please. So I now want to segue, if I could, go back one, please. Oh my, it's shooting ahead here. Go back one more. Thank you. Oh, it's fighting you. Try to queue up the Taxiway Tango slide. There you go. Okay, so I wanted to talk a little about, oh dear, it's just fighting us, isn't it? Not able to get it to stay queued. All right, thank you, if it'll accommodate us. And so on Taxiway Tango, the purpose of the project was to reconstruct some of the most distressed pavements at BWI Marshall. This is a heavily utilized taxiway. It basically handles the move and flow from the entire terminal area to the primary active runways at our airport. What was key is that this was an expedited design to capture fiscal year 2020 FAA grant funding under their airport improvement program. And what was key here, because of the COVID-19, this is occurring during COVID-19, is that we had a CARES funding built into the project. So this project was initiated in March. Bids were received by June. And you see it's what we call a major capital project. The construction costs of over $10 million. And what's again key is that the project took advantage of the additional funding available under the CARES Act, because under AIP funding at an air carrier airport, usually funding is 75% federal funding discretionary, and the 25% is by the local sponsor. But because of COVID-19 and the acts of Congress, we were able to get 100% funding for this project. All the more reason to have that project ready to go as we did, to maximize on the availability of federal funding. So the project is preparing and will publish a mitigation plan. So just like the A extension, 5-gate extension project, we will have a project-specific COVID-19 plan for the Taxiway Tango project. Next slide, please. And one of the interesting things that to share with the engineers and construction managers on the project is that the key to success in air carrier airport construction is how to phase the work to maintain operations. So through our partnership with Southwest Airlines, and because of the 5-gate extension on A, creating 5 additional gates, ostensibly for the AB terminal project, which is on a pause as well, we were able to take advantage of those 5 gates to allow us to do a phased construction of Taxiway Tango and never impacting more than 5 gates at one time. And this is just a graphical example of the phasing vision that was included in the project documents. Next slide, please. Now we'll talk about some of the recovery initiatives. And so surprisingly, during the course of the COVID-19 challenge facing us, we had a project already queued up, already funded for restroom improvements at BWI Marshall. This is the #1, and if you'll pardon the pun, #2, depending upon the survey out there, national surveys, the #1 or #2 most important feature of an air carrier airport are the restrooms to the passenger using the airport. So our restroom design is literally during the design, we have COVID-19 occur, and immediately we see that there are some industry best practices that are already starting to come forward to minimize the risk of transmission of infectious disease. And so it literally had an impact on the design. And so our design shifted to a focus of resilience through cleanability. You see it in quotes. It had to be easily cleaned. It had to be disinfected to guarantee to give us safeguards for the health and welfare of the travelers and the airport staff working at the airport. So what were some of those design ideas that were put into play in the design is we incorporated alternative finishes to promote that easier cleaning and sanitation. So I'll give you just a simple example. Normal tile work in the restroom, historically, you'll use a cementatious grout. We said, well, no, we could use an epoxy grout because it doesn't have that absorptive characteristic. It's easily cleaned. But then we also looked at, well, maybe we should go to some alternative finishes. So the project will include an alternate that will allow us to use glass finishes, which has considerably less joints to clean. So we use the phrase large format materials. We wanted to reduce the number of joints throughout the bathroom because that's where the microbes can potentially hide. So as an example, on the sinks, the restroom sinks, we went with separation of sinks to build into the design social distancing while at the same time providing the capacity that was needed by our restroom facilities. And then one example of reducing the cross traffic is individual paper towel dispensers at those sinks, again, to avoid that person crossing against another person. And in the pictures here, you just see some of the renderings for the restrooms that are being built at the airport, that will be built at the airport. Next slide, please. I want to drill, if I could, into some of those improvements. So the ongoing restroom improvements at BWI, as I said earlier, incorporates the best practices in the industry with a goal towards more effectively combating infectious disease transmission. So some of the things that came into the project was touchless faucet operation, touchless toilet and urinal flush controls, touchless free technology for the soap, the paper towel, and hand sanitizer dispensers. And then one of the nice things that we was able to accommodate in the program is this introduction of intelligent monitoring of the restroom consumables, which reduces the need to physically check the dispensers. So we are trying to protect the passengers and reduce our physical maintenance presence in the restroom while it's being used by the passengers. And when we come into a restroom, it's because it needs servicing, not we're going to check to see if it needs servicing. Next slide, please. So another project that was directly related to COVID-19, of course, was the protection of the employees and passengers. And for the MAA, we installed nearly 180 plexiglass barriers at all of those customer interaction points in the terminal. And you actually see in the photographs, the collage here, you'll see the airport information booth, you see exit control for the Customs and Border Protection, and you see one of the guards, I think, sitting at their table, and everybody has that separating barrier. So this was used both at CBP, Customs and Border Protection, was used at the gates, at the ticket counters, the common use terminal equipment counters, information desks, the security desks, police podiums, anything that was MAA owned and controlled directly, we installed plexiglass, as did our tenants as well. And we worked with our tenants to rapidly approve permits for those installations, for those safety installations. Next slide, pretty please. So here are just some examples of the tenant improvements through the terminal area. You see in food and beverage, ticketing counters for the carriers. So literally hundreds of shields installed throughout the terminal. One other amazing innovative effort that was frankly piloted by the MAA is that we were when COVID-19 hit, we were in the middle of doing our environmental assessment for the airport. This is under the NEPA Act and was obviously a document being prepared by for the FAA, by the MAA and our consultant team. And it's important is that you have to have public engagement as part of the FAA issuance of finding for the project. Well, that normally in pre-COVID environment would mean face-to-face public meetings. But with COVID-19, we could not do that. And so we proposed to the FAA, rather than wait for the solution to COVID, the vaccine, which could cost us a year or more in delay to the environmental assessment finding, we said, why not a virtual public review comment period? And so we worked it out with the FAA, we worked it out with the communities, and we proceeded ahead with that. And so we held 2 innovative virtual public workshops in May of this year. We had at any one of those workshops, there were multiple times, 80 attendees participating. And what the good news is that we got favorable response in terms of how we conducted the meeting, the safety of the meeting, but we also got good factual discourse between ourselves and the public. And the FAA are now taking all the comments received, which we've responded to, and they are completing that environmental document as I speak today. We expect to see something the end of the month. Next slide, pretty please. So with respect to the airport, one of the biggest challenges we have with airports is where to park the aircraft. Even in a normal operation, it is a challenge as to where do you park the aircraft. You always have to have parking, not just at gates. So you're parking aircraft at aprons as well. Now you introduce COVID-19, in which a significant percentage of the nation's fleet are now grounded. So the air carriers requested from us remote parking positions at BWI. It just made sense. And so we worked out an operational plan with Wayne Pinnell, my counterpart in operations and maintenance, and his team, and came up with a practical, implementable operational parking plan that did not take up usable gates, that did not impede aircraft movements along the primary taxiway routes, and did not also compromise our Part 77 imaginary surfaces, which is what protects the aircraft movement areas and arrival departure routes. Next slide, please. Lastly, I want to talk about is our IT side. So working with my counterpart, Ed Carey, and his team in IT, we work with what's called the BWI Touchless Technologies. And so this is biometric and touchless technology being studied for implementation throughout the airport. We already have some things in place, but we're studying always to be better. So this is a from check-in to boarding. Ricky touched on this in his opening remarks. The goal is to reduce the potential spread of pathogens by providing the autonomous, hands-free, self-processing solution for our passengers. Well, what does that mean? Well, let me give you some specifics. So we're preparing, and we use the phrase in quotes, roadmap to document what it is we're doing today already. What is the industry doing today already? What could we be doing? And then how do we do it? And so it's a plan. Everything requires a plan. Then we work the plan. The TSA, one of our partners in touchless technology, have deployed what they call the CAT document technology, document check technology at security screening checkpoints where the boarding passes are no longer required. The passenger inserts their ID themselves. The TSA officer does not have to touch passenger documents. Oh my goodness, is that an improvement? The airlines are evaluating right now self-bag drop systems and processes so that you don't have that interplay. And then the MAA is pursuing a biometric exit pilot program that is pending the return of international traffic and following the new seat. Remember, it's not just federal and state. When I say federal, it's also Customs and Border Protection because their guidance also changes with time. And then to that point, the Customs Border Protection are resuming the deployment of the biometric entry in August of this year. That was the first round, and they're doing it at Dallas, Houston, Minneapolis, and Salt Lake. And BWI is on the list to follow. So we're looking forward to being included in the next deployment. Next slide. I think that covers this. No, I apologize. I forgot about our recalibrating. So let's talk a little bit about our building, the existing infrastructure. So the team is looking at the heating, ventilation, cooling system at the airport to assess, is there a way to reduce the potential airborne transference of pathogens through our handling system? So one of the things we quickly did is to shift over to MERV 16 filters. We're studying the installation of ultraviolet germicidal irradiation, they call it UVGI systems, in air handling units and ductwork. We've also looked at increasing the amount of outdoor air introduction for those periods when the terminal has high occupancy levels. And then we plan on having that study complete, and then we'll move forward with the implementation, continued implementation this year. Next slide, pretty please. There was the last one.
Okay.
So, Alan, I turn it over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. So again, I encourage everyone to submit questions. If we don't get to your questions, they will be published subsequent to the presentation with answers. So it's good to get the questions in. But Paul, we do have a few questions for you. Several national and global airport officials have called for an international standard for health screening. Has MAA seen any progress on this front?
I get the mic on. So the MAA, I am not aware of us looking at the international health screening. We've been working, at least in our shop, through the U.S. domestic side, through our associations, ACI, AAAE. Ricky, I don't know if you want to add something to that, if you're with us.
Trying to find a mute button. No, there's nothing I have to add to that, Paul. That's a good question. I think we should probably follow up and provide some additional information in our follow-up response.
Thank you. And thank you, Alan, for that question. Go to the next.
Yep. First, you get a thank you for the presentation, and I'm sure that's for you and Ricky as well. What is the plan going forward for the AB connector and baggage handling system project?
Okay, I tell you what, I'm not going to steal Ricky's thunder on that one. And the reason I say that is because our Secretary of Transportation, for those folks who have been attending the CTP tour, the road tour, it has been addressed directly by our Secretary. And Ricky, do you mind just briefing folks on what our plan is?
Yeah, so as a part of the the pandemic, we've had to rethink the schedule for a number of projects. The AB project is a project that will be funded through our revenue bonds. And if you've been paying attention to the revenue bond markets, it's rather skittish right now. As a matter of fact, it's negative on the industry. And so we pressed the pause button until the bond markets were able to kind of regain their footing. We think that that there should be some normalcy, some new normalcy with the bond market sometime early next year. And so that's kind of what we're looking at, is kind of jump-starting that project in earnest sometime in January. You'll begin to see, however, some movement in terms of restarting the engineering associated with that project much sooner than that. We're hoping that we can begin to jumpstart the project in the next couple of months. But in terms of funding the total project, that's going to be sometime in the first quarter of next year, as the bond markets regain their confidence. It's well, as you can imagine, we talk to Southwest Airlines on a weekly basis, and this is always one of the items on the agenda. It's still a very important project to them. It's a very important project to us. And again, when the bond markets regain their confidence or some normalcy, we'll begin to move aggressively with that project. Our plan is to maintain the same schedule as we started out with. That will be very difficult to do, I know, but Paul Shank is not one to run away from a challenge, and we'll kind of make those adjustments when we restart the project.
Excellent, thank you. I think we have time for one more question, and Paul, the question is, are you seeing COVID driving any changes to current design criteria? You mentioned the restrooms had already some good rules of thumb, but are you seeing any other changes, such as HVAC changes or anything like that in current designs?
That's a wonderful question. So you hit it spot on the head. First and foremost was the restrooms. But then we're on top of it. We clearly saw industry. We're looking at the HVAC systems, and we made some immediate changes just in terms of filters, but we're expanding beyond that. It's also lighting systems in the airport. And we talked about, when we talked about easily maintainable surfaces and less joints, well, that isn't just then for restrooms. That's for any space that we will build. So as AB restarts, which is our next significant vertical project to undertake at the airport, clearly we're going to have to factor that into the design. So it's not just the restrooms, and it's the same with the concessions. So we permit and approve all of the concessions improvements at the airport through our Office of Architecture. And so they too will be looking at making sure that the materials and finishes are used in the concessions, because those are points of passenger customer interface, not just ticket counters, not just the restrooms, not just the hold rooms, but also the concessions. So it's a really across the board. And the other thing, which I think Ricky touched upon in his opening remarks, is that Ricky early on had the MAA form kind of a COVID-19 committee that was comprised of representatives from every division in the MAA, and they worked collaboratively looking at each of their areas, their lanes of expertise, their lanes of authority, as to what COVID-19 specific things can we do immediately, as in today or tomorrow. What can we do, in the short term, intermediate, and long term? So it has crossed the lines in all of our design considerations. That was a great question. Thank you for asking it.
Okay, then again, for all the attendees, please continue to submit your questions. They will be answered, even if they're not answered during the live presentation. Kiva, back to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Paul. We appreciate your commitment to improving and preserving our infrastructure. Again, if you submitted a question that was not read by Alan, we will be distributing a follow-up email with answers. And now I will introduce our last set of speakers, Tony Frascarella is the president of the American Council of Engineering Companies, or ACEC, Maryland. Under his one-year term as president, Tony's vision is to continue the work started by previous leadership by advancing the business interests of engineering companies and by enhancing the impact of the profession through thoughtful advocacy, education, business acumen, and safe and impactful solutions. Jim Otradovec has served as the executive director of ACEC Maryland since 1988. He is responsible for carrying out the mission and strategic plan of ACEC Maryland and overseeing administrative functions and programs. Together, Tony and Jim have worked diligently to understand the impacts of the pandemic on the industry. We welcome Mr. Tony Frascarella and Mr. Jim Otradovec to the discussion. And now we will hear from Tony and Jim.
Good afternoon. Paul, I must say, looking out the window today, it's a good thing that you're giving today's presentation and not flying a plane. First, as Kiva said, my name is Jim Otradovec, Executive Director with ACEC Maryland. And I'd like to start by thanking Executive Director Smith and his team at MAA for providing this opportunity to share the consultant perspective on the devastating impact of COVID-19. MAA has always played an integral role in our business opportunities forums, and we very much appreciate the continuing partnership with the administration. As a point of introduction, the American Council of Engineering Companies Maryland advocates for the business interests of consulting firms and represents 90 firms employing approximately 6,500 professionals in Maryland. Approximately 40% of our member firms are either SBE or MBE firms. Member firms provide over 90% of the consulting service in the state, and we are one of the 52 member organizations that make up the American Council of Engineering Companies Federation, which is headquartered in Washington, D.C. Similar to other industries, the uncertainty of the current times has dominated every aspect of our member firms' operations. However, principals have been extremely complimentary of the consistently high quality of work being produced by their employees, who in many cases continue to work remotely. Recognizing the devastating impact of this pandemic, to assist member firms and government agencies early on, ACEC Maryland compiled best practices from our firms to assist in safely reopening their offices. Not surprisingly, ACEC Maryland has eliminated all in-person activities until at least the end of the calendar year, and will reevaluate the situation in January. This has necessitated that we restructure the budget for the current fiscal year and provide virtual programming focusing on timely subject matter. Membership in ACEC Maryland has remained strong throughout the pandemic, and I've been told by member firm representatives that now more than ever, they see the need for the organizational representation and advocacy provided by ACEC Maryland and its parent organization, ACEC, who advocates on behalf of the profession at the national level. I'd like to now turn it over to ACEC Maryland President Tony Frascarella.
Thank you, Jim. I'd also like to say thank you to Executive Director Smith and the whole MAA team for letting us have the opportunity to talk with you today during your town hall. As Jim mentioned, what we did when asked how have we been doing, or the industry's been doing during the COVID crisis and what we think will be happening in the future. We canvassed all our firms and we have come back with a lot of different ways of looking at this. You know, before COVID hit, and a lot of these comments, I will say that they're somewhat related to MAA specifically, but also to overall MDOT activities. So before COVID hit, you know, things had been pretty normal, I guess. Work had been progressing fairly well. We know from an SHA perspective, and maybe from an overall CTP perspective, there had been somewhat of a downturn in some capital budget and the program on a capital budget side. And that affected some of the firms somewhat. But overall, everybody was working pretty well. when COVID hit, obviously, as you saw from a design and planning perspective, many of the projects were shut down, and that, obviously that impacted our firms tremendously. A lot of different people who were working on things were shut down immediately. But it has affected different firms differently. We have a number of firms that are large multinational firms that work with MAA and the rest of NDOT. But we also have a number of smaller firms, these SBE firms, that are really local. But they survive a lot on what MDOT does and their budgets. So I guess when COVID hit, everyone has been working tremendously hard to keep staff busy. Some firms have had to put people on furlough and actually even had some staff reductions as much as 5% at some firms. One principal at a larger firm actually reduced his salary for the 2020 down to minimum wage. The SBE perspective on what happened during COVID, many of the firms were able to retain staff due to the PPP loan program, but shortly they may have to start considering layoffs. So it affected design and planning significantly, and even on the construction side, where many of our firms support MDOT, MAA, and the other TBUs through construction management and inspection. A lot of construction was continued through, but some firms were affected by slowdown in construction activities. So some of the overall concerns, were we successful in transitioning to a remote workforce? Some firms see that there's a long-term team collaboration may decline. I think there's a lot of face-to-face opportunities in our profession, which you don't get when you're working remotely. And most firms predominantly are still working remotely. Mentoring of young engineers is challenging in a remote environment. We've also seen that there's some problems with the changing guidance from the federal and state government and balancing that information with local guidance and restrictions. Another overall concern from the SBE world is what's going to happen in the future with our budgets. Obviously, and how can that be recognized, I guess, in the future to support our small firms. Jim, would you like to take over and talk about some impacts from Canceling project?
Thank you, Tony. Yes, I'd like to address some of the specific impacts of the MDOT TBU suspending and canceling projects, and also touch a little bit on the national perspective. First, I'd like to acknowledge both Secretary Slater and MDOT SHA Administrator Smith for inviting members of the transportation industry to the table at the onset of the pandemic to discuss the uncertainties of this novel coronavirus and to chart a course forward. These efforts that continue today have greatly assisted the transportation industry in navigating through both the health and financial concerns associated with this devastating pandemic. We've already heard that the CTP has been trimmed $3 billion to $13 billion. Firms are obviously closely monitoring the situation, but already there has been a huge impact. Firms are canceling hiring plans and layoffs, as Tony mentioned, are a possibility. Firms are currently utilizing work sharing to retain employees. Some firms have cited a 5% reduction in workforce due to MAA's reduction in projects and the up to 50% cut in design and planning at MDOT SHA. From an SBE perspective, design has been impacted more than inspection, and due to projects being put on hold or suspended due to a lack of funds, firms are struggling to keep design staff billable. Our firms had concern over the funding levels in the Transportation Trust Fund prior to the pandemic. It's only been exacerbated by COVID. Recognizing this problem, ATC Maryland has joined a coalition of other transportation industry partners called Together for Transportation Funding, or TTF, that is spotlighting the important contribution that transportation makes to the economy and the need to revisit the current funding formula. As you know, infrastructure spending has led this country out of previous economic downturns, and it's imperative that our elected officials act immediately and implement both short-term and long-term sustainable solutions. From a national perspective, industry-wide, in February 2020, engineering employment hit an all-time record high, but then the pandemic hit. Over 80% of jobs were lost through layoffs and furloughs, but since May, the industry employment has steadily grown. And on a positive note, about half of that employment has returned. Construction spending, as you can imagine, also took a huge hit, dropping from a record level, and now they have gained back almost half of those losses. Private markets have recovered faster and have retained almost 2/3 of the decline in just the 3 months. M&A activity is down about 50% year over year from March through May, but by last week, they are now back to within 5% of the 2019 pace. So Tony, if I could turn it back over to you, please. No, I'm sorry, let me hit another point too I wanted to cover.
Sure.
Regard to HR and IT departments' involvement in COVID relief. Not surprisingly, both HR and IT departments have played integral roles in allowing firms to operate during this pandemic, and I'd like to recognize their important contributions. In a lot of cases, firms really could not survive without these two important departments. These committees have been meeting bi-weekly and have demonstrated the importance of sharing best practices during this crisis. Challenges managing staff traveling out of state and returning to the local workforce have been mentioned. Also, managing visitors has also been very challenging for some firms. SPE firms cited the need to be very flexible and conservative with their approach to the office and to their employees. And principals have spent hundreds of hours just trying to grasp what the local state rules are regarding going back to an office space, what the PPP loan parameters were and are regarding employment, and understanding what firms must pay with regard to quarantine time and other financial considerations. So now I would like to turn it back to Tony.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. The next question, I guess, is a return to normalcy. And I believe the engineering industry and the consultant world, we're not that really good at looking out in the future, but we do have a feeling that it's going to be a long time before we return to normalcy. You know, we figure a majority of our staff will continue to work remotely, at least into next year. Some of us feel as if we won't return to normalcy until possibly a vaccine is available and available widely to us. I think the biggest thing that will help us as an industry return to normalcy is the impact that we've realized on the CTP, and we've talked about and are realizing when the budgets are fixed or they come back to regular levels and project delays are eliminated, we'll return to some sort of normal business operations. So the outlook over the next few years is many of us are very concerned. You know, a lot of these projects on the planning and design side throughout MDOT, and many of the programs have still not come back. Some of the capital programs are going to be reduced 30 to 50%. That's going to tremendously affect the industry and most of the consulting firms. And that's real jobs in the long run. You know, many of our firms within ACEC Maryland are very dependent on MDOT TBU budgets and the CTP and how and where projects move forward. But we also see that the political polarization in Washington negatively impact the ability to pass traditional bipartisan type initiatives like, you know, sustainable infrastructure funding. And we all have to figure out a way for Washington to give back and approve some of these programs that they traditionally have in the we're also somewhat concerned that without action at the state level, that there's possibly the local match that we obtain from federal grant allowances may not be available. So I don't know the results from that, but hopefully that doesn't become a negative for us. So obviously, most of us, Jim mentioned work sharing. Some of the larger firms that have offices all over in the US or other parts of the world, they're able to shift staff and work on other projects elsewhere. But like I said, the local companies, they're being impacted tremendously. So there's no new hiring predominantly going on and possible layoffs coming. So hopefully over the next 18 months, we come back to some sort of normalcy. So there were, I think there were a few positives from the pandemic. It has provided collaborative technology advances. We talked about that from an IT perspective. Those things are really embraced by the younger staff. From a small business perspective, while firmly believing in the benefits of personal interaction, principals should be more willing to allow those that cannot drive or come to the office to operate in a remote world. So one final note, I think a positive came from the pandemic. We're operating more in electronic invoicing and proposal procurement perspective. So if those actions can move forward and the technology continue, that would be a positive too. And with that, that's what Jim and I had to talk about, Alan. We'll take any questions if there are any.
Thank you, Tony and Jim. Good presentations. Good seeing you. Couple of questions so far. Probably got room for one more. You kind of touched on this, but do you see teleworking in the consulting engineering industry as maybe opening a new paradigm for staffing of some of the offices and some of the companies?
Well, I'll mention, I'll try to answer that first. I know at my company, we've been, I wouldn't say struggling with it, but absolutely talking about it because it has opened up a new opportunity to work remotely. And although we feel as if the one-on-one, the interaction, the physical interaction of, in the design world, in the engineering world is important, we're becoming more adept to the opportunity to work remotely and stuff. But I think what we are struggling with is are we being as efficient as we can be? And that's still a question out there that we need to answer. So, but it absolutely will, we're thinking, continue on even beyond the pandemic.
As I sit in my home office asking these questions, so yes, I get it. Next question, and Tony, I'll just push this to you. Jim may want to chime in as well. But knowing that ACEC has always been very, active lobbying for industry, what are some of the specific points you're pushing to some of the political leadership in the country, whether it be on the state or the national level, and what's some of the feedback you're getting from them?
We have, yeah, okay, Jim, go ahead.
No, I'd just like to say one of the things we're looking at is eliminating the floor that was when the bill, which is now law, was passed in 2013. There was no funding floor, and then at that time the models were based on gas values of about, I believe it was $3.40 a gallon, and now that it's down to $2.25, there's nothing to recover, no way to regroup what was being lost. So that's one thing that I think everyone can agree to. And the other would be possibly also addressing other ways of forming. Maybe the taxing at the pump is a possibility. That's something that we've discussed with elected officials, and they seem to agree with that philosophy. We'd love to get an actual increase in the fuel tax. I'm not sure that's going to fly, but it's something we'd probably push for, figuring that the other things I mentioned is a fallback position.
I'm sorry.
I'll just add, Alan, that through our work with this transportation coalition that is industry-wide, also we have not really vetted this with MDOT yet, but there's discussions on whether we could push forward a model of regional transportation taxing authorities that would be transportation only funding, similar to some of the what Virginia has in Northern Virginia and Hampton Roads. That's been talked about. So a lot of these things are taking speeding up, I guess, and we're collectively going to be addressing as the legislators and talking to them and getting the word out on a lot of these issues.
Okay. Ricky or Paul, we have a little bit more time, it looks like, and a couple more questions. If there's no just questions going back over the presentation in total, do we want to cover those?
Sure.
And Alan, if I could, I was pondering that wonderful question about international health screening. So I'm going to give a partial response, but I agree with Ricky. We need to look into it a little more depth. But what's important is that we're following the national CDC guidelines. That's what the state of Maryland is doing. It's what the governor wants us to do. But it's still, the CDC is not just looking at what the U.S. is doing. They're looking at what the world is doing. So I would argue it's pretty much best practices. But in their specifics, where Ricky, I will look at it for you, is what is the international air carrier airport community doing that might be different than what we're doing? That was a good question. Thanks.
Okay, so we'll take one more of the general questions, and then again, I think the rest of these will be answered offline. But one last question coming in for Paul or Ricky. Other than self-bag drop systems, are the airlines requiring any modifications to the terminal technologies or processes? And Paul, I think you talked about some biometrics in your presentation.
Yeah, so the biggie was not just with bag drops, but also ticketing. It's just visualize that the ideal scenario is that you don't touch anybody or anything as you proceed through this airport to your airplane. There is one other rather interesting technology that it's part of the study, is the UAV treatment of baggage itself as it's checked and it passes through the baggage handling system, because there are hands that touch it as it goes to and from the aircraft. So that is one of the things that I didn't touch upon, but it is part of that study for biometric.
Excellent. Well, I think we'll wrap up the Q&A part here. And oops, I'm sorry, there was some questions on seat blocking and health practices by the airlines, and so I've been asked to read one of the answers that was texted in. It says, to answer a couple of questions on airline health practices and seat blocking. Airlines each have their own policies. Southwest, for one, is currently limiting booking to 2/3 of seat capacity, but this morning they announced that they will open seats on all flights starting on the 1st of December. So again, that's part of that bullish, I think, behavior, Ricky, that you had alluded to before. So thank you for your questions. I appreciate being part of the presentation, and Kiva, I will toss it back to you.
Thank you. Thank you, Tony and Jim, and thanks to all of the program participants, Ricky Smith and Paul Shank, for the useful information you shared today about promoting the safety measures that are in place and how we are implementing the pandemic recovery strategies at MAA. And thank you to Alan for managing the Q&A portion of the program. Also, thanks to our production team that includes Tom Verghese, Joe Schneider, Rachel Goodman, Devin Beasley, and Stacy Gordon. I want to remind everyone that we will be sending a follow-up email that will include the PowerPoint slides, the recording of this event, and any questions we were not able to cover during the program today. Also, please keep in mind that BWI Marshall is active on social media, and we invite you to follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. In closing, on behalf of the Maryland Aviation Administration, we want to thank all of you, our consultants and contractors, for attending. Your support and participation are important, and the MAA team is committed to your success. Until next time, be safe, stay well. This concludes our program.